All right, so
Yeah.
have you ever noticed, like, how we can be kind of hypocritical sometimes?
Okay.
Like, I can't stand when people are late,
Right.
but then I'm always the one rushing in like, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry I'm late."
Yeah, the classic, do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly. And it gets even trickier when you think about, like, our core beliefs,
Mhm.
politics, religion, philosophy.
Mhm.
How do we reconcile those beliefs with the, let's just say, not so great moments in history
Right.
of those who might share them? So today we are diving into an article called Honoring Both Sides to kind of unpack all of this.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look at those messy complexities we often just kind of try to avoid.
Totally. And right away, the author hits us with this idea of tribal identities, like we're practically wired to connect with those who
Mm.
share our values, cultures, even our beliefs. But what does honoring both sides even mean when we are talking about these like deep-seated tribal instincts?
Right.
Is it about like agreeing with everything, or is there something deeper there?
Yeah. That's the core of it. It's not about just accepting everything blindly, but it's about recognizing that inherent human tendency to align with, our own.
Okay.
And the author takes it a step further and draws this parallel to Carl Schmitt,
Okay.
who was a political theorist who believed that all political thought really boils down to this one fundamental distinction:
And what's that?
friend and enemy.
Friend and enemy? Okay, so how does that friend or enemy idea actually play out in the real world? Like, historically speaking, I mean, it's easy to say we favor people who are like us,
Right.
but how does that actually like manifest in actions and consequences?
Well, Schmidt believed that this friend enemy distinction is really the core of how we form groups,
Oh,
and
yeah.
importantly, how we justify actions within those groups.
Okay.
The author uses this to explain how throughout history, groups have defined themselves and others based on these shared traits: ethnicity, religion, nationality.
It makes sense.
You name it.
So because someone is deemed a friend, we're more likely to overlook or downplay their negative actions.
Yeah.
That's kind of a tough pill to swallow.
It is, and the article doesn't shy away from that. It really tackles this tension between, on the one hand, wanting to learn from other cultures and broaden our perspectives,
Right.
but then on the other hand, staying true to our own identities and values.
It's interesting because the author actually argues that we can do both. They
Yes.
suggest acknowledging the value of other cultures without needing to erase our differences
Right.
or abandon our own.
Yeah, it's not about erasing borders or striving for this bland uniformity. The author actually argues the opposite,
Yeah.
that strong, distinct nations are vital. And it's through those distinct identities that we can best learn from one another and create a richer global community.
That's a really unique perspective. It's almost
Okay.
like saying that our differences are what make the world interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if
Mm-hmm.
we were all the same, there would be nothing to learn or appreciate.
Exactly.
But it
Yeah.
begs the question, can we truly appreciate other cultures while remaining firmly rooted in our own?
It's a tightrope walk for sure. It requires a great deal of self-awareness, critical thinking, and a willingness to really grapple with the gray areas.
Yeah.
Which brings us to what I found to be one of the most powerful parts of the article.
You mean where the author dives into the darker side of their own tribe?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They talk about this struggle to reconcile their support for certain historical figures and groups,
Hmm.
knowing full well those figures were involved in some seriously negative actions.
And the author gets incredibly specific, too.
They do.
They discuss their perspective on Nazi Germany,
Right.
which is already a heavy topic
Yeah.
compared to their stance on the independent state of Croatia during World War II.
And that's where things get really, really challenging.
Okay.
For those who may not be familiar, the independent state of Croatia, which was run by the Ustasha regime,
Right.
was responsible for truly horrific atrocities, particularly against Serbs. The author really lays bare the brutal reality of the Ustasha's actions.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. It really highlights that moral complexity the author is wrestling with. I mean, condemning an ideology is one thing,
Right.
but then to try and understand the motivations of those who subscribe to it,
Yeah,
especially when those motivations led to such horrific acts.
absolutely. And this is where the author's personal background adds another layer to the story.
Okay.
They mention their connection to the Serbian Orthodox Church,
Right.
which understandably shapes their perspective on the Ustasha regime.
It makes you think, can we actually separate the actions of individuals or even groups from the broader ideology they claim to represent?
Right.
I mean, how do we even begin to process that?
That's a question with no easy answers, and it's exactly what the author wants us to grapple with. But it's not just about looking back at history. It's
Right.
about recognizing these patterns in our own time.
So they want us to see where this friend-enemy dynamic plays out in our world today.
Exactly. That's at it. Analyzing history is one thing, but recognizing these patterns in our own time is when it becomes real urgent, even.
So how do we even begin to, like, reconcile these conflicting ideas? Honoring our tribe while acknowledging its flaws, learning from others, while staying true to ourselves. It's a lot, right? Well, the author takes a really unexpected turn to explore this.
Yeah.
They go all the way back to this medieval concept.
Okay.
You familiar with the Nine Worthies?
Oh, yeah, the Nine Worthies, right?
It might seem totally random,
Right.
but it actually ties in perfectly. So for those who may not know, these figures were held up as like the epitome of chivalry
Right.
and like ideal manhood throughout the medieval period.
Okay.
And they weren't exactly a homogenous group, right?
No, not at all. You had figures like Hector Troy, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar,
Wow.
representing all these different cultures and belief systems, some even considered pagans during that time.
Right. Okay, so we've got like these legendary figures from the ancient world.
Right.
But it was a mixed bag for sure.
Yeah.
Like they weren't all cut from the same cloth.
Exactly. And then alongside those figures, you have like biblical heroes like Joshua and King David.
So here's where it gets really interesting. They included Judas Maccabeus as well.
Whoa, hold on now. If I'm remembering correctly, wasn't Judas Maccabeus all about rebelling against
Yes.
the very Hellenic world that like Alexander the Great represented?
Exactly.
Talk about conflicting ideologies.
Right. So you have these figures who, in their own time, were on opposite sides.
Totally.
These major historical conflicts.
Yeah.
And yet they're celebrated together as these examples of virtue and chivalry.
So how do we make sense of that? Like, was the medieval worldview just a collection of contradictions?
Well, not quite. I think what the author is getting at is that even those we might see as adversaries can embody these shared values.
Okay.
They contribute to a larger narrative that goes beyond those divisions.
Mm.
It's not about erasing those differences,
Yeah.
but about recognizing the complexities.
That makes me think about the author's point earlier about strong, distinct nations. Maybe it's about recognizing those distinctions,
Yeah.
those opposing forces, even as
Or-
part of a greater whole. Exactly. And the author drives this point home with another, perhaps even more striking example, Saints Peter and Paul.
Oh, wow.
These two definitely didn't always see eye to eye.
That's an understatement. I mean, from what I remember, they had some serious clashes of personality and ideology.
Oh, they did. They really
Yeah.
did. But even with those differences, those very real conflicts,
Yeah.
the church recognizes their shared importance in spreading the Christian message. They're often even shown embracing in religious art.
Which is a really powerful image when you think about it.
It is.
Two figures, once at odds, now united in this common cause. It really makes you wonder if that's even possible in our world today.
And that's the question the author leaves us with. They're not saying we should ignore historical wrongs or pretend our differences don't matter,
Right.
but they suggest a way to acknowledge those complexities, those contradictions,
Okay.
without abandoning our own beliefs or values.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between acknowledging the negative aspects of history
Right.
and those who we align with,
Yeah.
while still recognizing that there is this possibility of shared values and common ground.
Yeah.
It's about embracing nuance and understanding that truth isn't always black and white.
Exactly. And it requires us to sit with that discomfort, to
Yeah.
resist that urge to simplify these complex issues into neat categories of good and bad.
Which is something that the author themselves really grapples with throughout this whole piece.
Yes.
Like, they're very open about their own internal struggles, their own conflicting viewpoints,
They are.
like where they admit to supporting certain aspects of Nazi Germany's ideology,
Yeah.
while simultaneously condemning the atrocities committed by the Croatian Ustasha regime.
Even though both were allies in World War II.
Right.
And the author doesn't shy away from that contradiction at all. They present their perspective, their struggle to reconcile these seemingly conflicting viewpoints
Yeah.
in a really raw and honest way.
Which, honestly, that's what I found so refreshing about this whole article. It avoids that trap of preaching from a soapbox.
Right.
Instead, it's like they're inviting us into this messy, complicated reality
Yes.
of trying to live with conviction
Yeah.
in a world that rarely offers us easy answers.
And that, I think, is such a powerful message for all of us, regardless of where we stand on the political or ideological spectrum.
Right.
Because ultimately, we're all just trying to make sense of this world to find our place in it.
Find our place.
And sometimes that means confronting uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
challenging our own closely held assumptions
Right.
and accepting that we might not have all the answers.
And
Yep,
that
yep.
is what being a true learner is all about.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging that there's always more to learn,
Okay.
more perspectives to consider.
More perspectives.
And more importantly, it's about how we engage with those different perspectives,
Right.
especially when they challenge our own.
Okay.
How do we bridge those divides without resorting to that same old friend-enemy dynamic?
Especially in today's world where everything feels so polarized.
Yes.
Every issue is a battle line.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to have those difficult conversations, those nuanced discussions,
Right.
if we aren't willing to at least try to understand where the other side is coming from?
It's a massive challenge, no doubt.
It is.
But I think the author offers this glimmer of hope.
How so? By pointing to these historical examples, like the Nine Worthies and Saints Peter and Paul,
Exactly.
to show us that it is possible.
Right. They remind us that even amidst conflict, disagreement, and yes, even hypocrisy, there's always the possibility of finding that common ground. It starts with being willing to look beyond those surface-level differences, those ingrained friend-enemy classifications, and recognizing that shared humanity that binds us.
It's like the author saying, look, it's okay to embrace the contradictions.
Yeah.
Both within ourselves and in the world around us. It's not about ignoring the tough parts of history
Right.
or pretending that we all think alike.
It's about recognizing those complexities without letting them paralyze us.
Right.
It's about how do we move forward with both conviction and compassion. Right.
Even when we're faced with these opposing viewpoints.
Which is way easier said than done, let's be real.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in our age of social media and instant judgments.
Yes.
It's so easy to slip into that us versus them mentality, to demonize people who disagree with us.
Absolutely. And that's where I think this call to honor both sides becomes so important. It's a call to resist those easy answers, those knee-jerk reactions. It's about acknowledging that even those we might consider enemies are still complex individuals.
Right.
They have their own stories, their own motivations.
Yeah, it's like that saying, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity.
Right.
But maybe even going a step further and saying, well, let's try to understand that stupidity.
Yes.
That different way of thinking before we just slap a label on it.
Exactly. It's about bridging those divides with curiosity instead of judgment.
Okay.
It's about asking, well, what led them to that belief? What experiences shaped their worldview? Which isn't to say that we have to agree with them. Right.
Of course not. Honoring both sides doesn't mean you just give up your own convictions. It's about recognizing that truth, real truth, is rarely black and white. It often lies somewhere in those messy gray areas.
And maybe those gray areas are where we find common ground and understanding.
Precisely. Because remember, even those 9 worthies who were held up as these exemplars of virtue, they had flaws too.
Oh, for sure.
They made mistakes. They acted out of self-interest.
Oh, for
They
sure.
even clashed with each other. But that didn't negate their positive qualities,
Right.
their contributions to the world.
So maybe it's about embracing those contradictions.
Yes.
Those imperfections within ourselves and in others.
Yes.
It's about holding those opposing ideas in our mind
Yes.
without feeling like we have to choose a side
Right.
or ignore the complexities.
Exactly. And I think that's the most valuable takeaway from this whole deep dive. It's a call to approach the world, and especially those who challenge us with open hearts and open minds.
Because in the end, isn't that really the key to navigating this messy, complicated, often hypocritical world of ours? It's about embracing the nuances, honoring the complexities,
It is.
and maybe even finding those unexpected points of connection with people.
And who knows? Maybe in doing so, we discovered there's actually more that unites us than divides us after all.
Well, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive, but the conversation doesn't have to end here. We want to hear from you.
Yes.
Where do you see this friend-enemy dynamic playing out in your own life, your relationships, your beliefs? Let us know.
And how can you apply this idea of honoring both sides to navigate those complexities with more empathy, understanding, and even grace?
Because sometimes those really tough questions, those challenging questions,
Right.
they're the ones that lead to the most profound self-discoveries. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.